Welcome everybody to the Galloway Glens Viking Tales from the Galloway Glens. My name's Helen Kerran. I'm the Education and Community Engagement Officer for the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership Scheme, and I'm delighted to welcome you all in. So we've got 90 minutes of Viking Tales and Adventures with Kafbad and Olaf, which I'm very much looking forward to. I'm just going to take the quick opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Galloway Glens and Can You Dig It? The Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership Scheme is a 5-year suite of 35 projects based here in Dumfries and Galloway. For those of us who know, we're up past Carsfairn in the north, past the beautiful Loch End, past Castle Douglas and out to the sea at Kirkcudbright in southwest Scotland. The aim of the Galloway Glens is to connect people with their local, cultural, natural and built heritage. And we're co-funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund to do that. And that core funding with the matched funding that we also get, it'll bring an investment of over £5 million into the area between 2018 when we started, 2023 when we finish. And then Can You Dig It is one of our flagship projects. It's a community archaeology project designed to really help people understand their own built heritage and their past in a really tangible way. We did loads of digs and workshops and explorations in 2019. But of course, this summer with the COVID restrictions, we're having to do things a bit differently. So we've moved our programme online, and this event now is one of a programme of online events all designed to show off all our different aspects of our amazing local heritage. We've got Claire Williamson from Rathmel Archaeology supporting us today. And of course, very importantly, we've got our Vikings. We've got Olaf. Hello. There we are. And we've got Cathbad.
Hello, Wilson.
There we go. So by way of introductions, nobody knows where Olaf came from. It is said that Olaf travels from place to place, telling stories in exchange for a place to sleep by the fire and some hot food. The stories are of Viking gods, of Odin, Thor and Loki, and all the other creatures that live in the Viking world. Elves and dwarves and men, giants and serpents and wolves. So sit back and listen to stories that are full of wonderful adventures, magic and mischief. And then we've got Cathbad. Cathbad grew up on the Isle of Arran. His dad was a Viking, but when he raided the island one year, instead of leaving with loot, he lost his heart to a Scottish girl. Cathbad's brothers grew up and took after his dad and became mighty warriors, and left Cathbad at home to look after and occasionally defend his farm, learning the stories of the Norse and Gaelic Goths, as well as everyone else who travelled around the Irish Sea region on boats. Eventually, Cathbad's brothers faced the fate of warriors, and Cathbad inherited the farm. It's mostly looked after by his children now, though, and he can travel around trading and telling tales. So sit back and enjoy as I hand you over to Olaf, the storyteller.
Hello, is anyone out there? Can you hear me? Well, welcome. I'm going to tell you a story today. Now, there's one catch. I tell stories so that I can have a place to sleep for the night and some food in my belly, and I like to, you know, I like my food, so I'm hoping after this story one of you will offer me a place by your fire and cook me some tea. So we'll see how that will be at the end. But today's story, I'm going to talk about the gods, the Viking gods. You know them all. Thor and Odin and Loki and Tyr and Freya. Well, the gods quite often get bored up in Asgard. You know Asgard, where the gods live, up in the clouds. And they like to go on adventures. And one day, 3 of the gods decided to go for a long adventure and go travelling. And they would travel down the Rainbow Bridge, or as you know it, a rainbow, down to Midgard, or as you call it, Earth, where you are right now. Midgard was a beautiful place. Beautiful, maybe not today, it's not so sunny today. And the gods wandered for a whole day. They climbed up cloud-topped mountains. They travelled down luscious green valleys. They bathed in rivers flowing. And they wandered deep into forests full of stags and squirrels and rabbits. Now, all of this was quite tiring, and by the end of the day, they decided they not only needed a nap, but they needed some food. They found themselves a beautiful field with beautiful trees, and they collected wood to make a fire. Now, They needed something to put on the fire, didn't they? They needed something to eat. So off went Honeyer to collect some food. And he looked around, couldn't find anything, and eventually he found a huge field full of ox. So anyone who doesn't know what an ox is, it's like a big cow. And he went up and he bopped one on the head and he brought it back to the fireplace. They chopped it up, put it on the fire, and it slowly began to cook. The fire rustled and crackled and cooked the food, and the smell was amazing. Odin sat at one side, Loki sat at the other, and Honeyer blew on the fire to keep it going, and it cooked and it cooked and it cooked, and it smelled amazing. Now by this time the gods' tummies were rumbling so loudly it sounded like thunder. So Honeyer reached in, picked up a leg, took it out the fire, and took a great big bite. And he spat it out. It was still raw. They threw it back on the fire, thinking he'd maybe just been a bit impatient, and they let it cook for another hour. And the fire rustled and crackled and cooked, and it smelt incredible, and the gods were starving. By this time, their tummies were rumbling so loudly, it was like thunder in the sky. And this time, Odin reached in and he took out an ox leg. He was so excited, his mouth was watering, and he took a huge big bite. Yuck, it was still raw. Threw it back in the fire in a huff. They just must have been so impatient to eat that they hadn't given it enough time, so they sat in a huff. Hungry now. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited another hour. By this time, the gods were in a terrible, terrible bad mood. You know what boys can be like when they're hungry. Yeah, they get grumpy, and they started nagging at each other and moaning and started to argue. And finally, after another hour passed, Loki reached in, grabbed an ox leg, took a big bite, and guess what happened? It was still raw. Now, by this time, the gods were furious. Loki threw the ox leg in the air and stomped about in a bad mood. They were in a terrible mood. They were grumpy. They were starving. They were hangry, I think is the word, I believe. Now, Odin stopped. He was the wisest of them all. Odin had given his eye for wisdom, and he had discovered the runes, and he stopped to think that maybe all was not as it seemed. He looked around carefully, and he looked at the fire, and he said, there must be some kind of magic or foul play here for this meat not to cook. Let us be careful and have our wits about us, for something here is not right. And suddenly, a booming voice from above in the tree cried out, you are wise, Odin. This is my land, and that is my fire, and that is my ox. And even Surt, the fire demon, would not let that meat cook unless I allow it. The gods looked up, and they saw a giant talking eagle. Now, I don't know about you, but if I saw a giant eagle in a tree talking to me, I would be rather worried. The gods were wary, very wary, but they were also really hungry. So they asked the eagle, please will you let the meat cook? We've been walking all day, we're so hungry. And the eagle replied, only if you will let me eat first, and you can eat whatever is left. The gods agreed, and the meat began to cook. Finally, the smell made the gods even more hungry, and they couldn't wait to fill their tummies with glorious food. And when the food was ready, the gods turned to the eagle and gestured and said, please, please take your fill. You have the first bite. But the eagle swooped down from the tree and ate the entire ox in one bite. Loki had had enough. He was cold, he was tired and hungry, and now he wasn't getting any dinner. He became so angry, he picked up a stick and he tried to strike the eagle. But the eagle was fast and grabbed the end of the stick with his talons and took off into the sky. Now Loki's hand was in the other edge, and it stuck by some kind of magic. And as the eagle took off into the sky, Loki went with him, and he was carried so high up into the sky, into the freezing clouds, that even the bogies in his nose turned to ice. The eagle took him through the clouds and the cold rain, and then dragged him all the way down and put his legs through the ocean as he flew just above the top of the sea. Then he flew across the top of the forest, so low that Loki was scraped by the branches and the trees. And then the eagle flew even lower, so that Loki's bottom bounced up and down and off the ground. Loki begged and pleaded and said, "Please let me go, please, I will do anything." And the eagle replied, "Anything? Anything?" And Loki said, "Yes, please, anything, anything." So the eagle let Loki go, and he fell all the way down through the sky, splat onto the ground. And the eagle landed gracefully beside him and transformed into his true form, because this was no eagle. This was a giant, and a particularly nasty giant named Thiazi. And he said to Loki, "Loki, my agreement with you is that you will return here in 7 days' time, and you will bring with me the magical goddess Eden, the goddess who keeps the golden apples that keep the gods young. If you do not return here, I will come to Asgard. I will find you, and I will take you out into the middle of the ocean and drop you there where Jormungandr, the giant world serpent, will eat you in one bite." Loki was tired, and he was scratched, and he was sore, and he was bleeding, and he just wanted to go home. So he agreed, "Yes, yes, anything, anything, I agree, please just let me go." So the deal was struck, and the eagle flew away, and Loki walked back to where Odin and Honir were waiting by the fire, cold and tired and hungry. And the gods returned to Asgard after such a terrible day, and they got on with all the important things that gods must do, and they gave no more thought to that nasty eagle. Until 7 days later, Loki began to panic. He knew that he had to fulfill his part of the deal, and he had to do what the eagle asked. So he went off to find Eden. Now, you may not have heard of Eden. Eden was a beautiful goddess, and she tended an orchard, and the orchard was full of golden apples, magical golden apples. Now, the gods ate these apples to stay young, and they would never age as long as they ate apples. Eden was beautiful and innocent and kind, and she had no idea of the wicked plans that Loki had for her. Loki walked into the orchard where he found her tending the trees, and he said, Eden, guess what? I was out adventuring the other day, and I found another orchard, and it looks just like yours, and there are apples that look exactly the same as yours. Why don't you come with me and bring your apples, and we'll compare and see if they're the same?" Eden had no reason not to believe Loki. Boys and girls, would you believe Loki? No, me neither, but she did. And she followed Loki down the rainbow bridge. And eventually they reached the field where they had lit the fire and the eagle had first appeared. Eden walked along and said, "Loki, I don't see any trees. I don't see any apples." Before Loki had a chance to speak, who came flying down from the sky? The giant eagle Thiazi. He appeared, and he snatched up Eden in one talon and the apples in another, and he flew off to the land of the giants, to Jotunheim. And he put Eden in his castle at the top of a tall tower, and he locked the door. And Loki, he sneaked back to Asgard and he acted as if nothing had happened and thought, I've got away with this one. And at first, no one noticed that Eden was missing. The gods were busy, doing what gods do, having adventures, and Thor was probably off fighting giants like he often did. But before long, the gods started to ache and get tired, and their hair started to turn grey, and their knees hurt, and their backs hurt, and their hips hurt, and they walked with a limp and bent over backs, and they couldn't move very fast at all. Something was wrong, and they were getting old. And if you want to know more about getting old, then just ask the grown-ups that are in the room with you right now. Now, when something goes wrong in Asgard, there's only one person to blame. And who's that? Who's normally to blame when there's trouble? That's right, Loki. Loki! So they sent Thor to find Loki. Loki was brought in and he was thrown down in front of the gods, and Odin demanded to know, where is Eden? Loki refused. I had no idea what you're talking about. Me cause trouble? Surely you must be mistaken. He tried every trick in the book, but the gods did not believe him. Thor strode in and he picked up Loki by his hair, lifted him up high and said, Loki, if you do not tell me where Eden is, I will break every bone in your body. Loki went, oh, I've suddenly remembered. Oh, and he spilled the beans. He told them everything. And the gods were furious. He said, Loki, you are responsible for Eden. You will go and get her back. Loki said, how do you expect me to get to Jotunheim? It's miles away. Unless the lovely Freya lets me borrow her cloak. Freya has a magical cloak full of feathers, and when you wear it, you turn into a falcon and you can fly through the sky. So Loki asked very nicely for this. He popped the cloak on, turned into a falcon, and off he flew to Jotunheim. When he got there, he flew around looking for the tower, and eventually he found it. He flew and landed on a tree branch just outside the tower, and he watched, and he watched, and he watched, until he saw Thiazi leave the castle. Then he thought, now's my chance. He flew into the tiny window and he transformed back into his form and he said, Eden, I'm here to rescue you. Do you think that Eden, in this tiny room, was happy at seeing Loki? She was furious. She picked up anything within her reach and threw it at him. She threw a chair, she threw a table, she even threw her golden apples. Calm down, he said. I'm here to rescue you. Please stop throwing things at me. Eventually, she calmed down and she said, yes, Loki, it's your job to rescue me and take me home, but how do you expect us to escape? There's a tiny window and that's it. Loki said, well, funnily enough, I'm going to use magic. I will turn you and your apples into an acorn and I'll carry you home. And that's what he did. He took Eden in one claw, the apples in another, and he flew out the window all the way back home to Asgard. But the story doesn't end there. Who came back just as Loki was flying out the window? But Thiazi! He was furious. How dare his prize escape? He turned back into the eagle and he set off in pursuit. Now, who do you think flies faster, a falcon or an eagle? Well, it was the eagle. Loki is flying as fast as he could, but the eagle was gaining ground. Back at Asgard, the gods gathered atop the walls of Asgard and looked out, and they could see Loki in the distance. Loki, hurry, he's behind you. And Loki tried to fly as fast as he could, but the eagle was gaining ground. The gods suddenly had to come up with a plan, and they started to gather firewood and anything that would burn, and they threw it over the walls of Asgard and built up a huge pyre. They're calling, Loki, hurry, he's gaining, he's right behind you. And Loki flew, and he flew, and he flew. The gods were standing holding torches, and as Loki flew over the walls, they threw the torches onto the pyre, and the pyre was engulfed in a huge flame. And just as Thiazi, the eagle, flew into it, the fire rushed up and engulfed him, and he fell down with a crash to the ground. But he wasn't quite dead. So, who did the gods call upon to finish this nasty giant? That's right. They called upon the mighty Thor. He strode in with a face like thunder, striking Thiazi directly on the head, killing him instantly. Now, Eden was safe, and the apples were returned, and the gods gained their youth back. And Loki never, ever, ever, ever did anything naughty again. Well, until the next time. But that's another story. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Olaf. That's really exciting tales. We've got a sort of comment in here from Mo, but an interesting one. You'd think gods would be more powerful than giants, really. Don't know if Olaf has a view on that.
Well, this is the thing. There's so much magic and trickery that goes on that you never know. I think sometimes the giants were smarter. And I think threatening Loki, because let's face it, Loki was only ever out to save his own skin. He was terrified of everyone, and he was out looking after number one. So if he was threatened with magic and scariness, he was going to give in, wasn't he? He's just selfish, Loki.
Very good. Anyone else got any other questions for Olaf about other places that she slept the night? Or I have a question. I thought Olaf was a boy's name for Vikings.
Ah, see, right, okay. Well, I'll tell you the answer, but you have to promise that you'll all keep it a secret. I know there's a lot of you, but do you promise? Yeah. Okay. Now, Viking women are meant to stay at home. They're meant to stay at home and do boring things like cook and clean and sew. And I don't like doing things like that. I like having adventures and telling stories. So I have to travel around and pretend I'm a boy. And to do that, I have to take a boy's name. I make a convincing boy. I'm Olaf. So I have to pretend to be a boy. Otherwise, they might make me stay home and do the washing up.
Well, very good choice, Olaf, I would say. Very good choice indeed. We've got one question from Hippo. Did the Loki mean for the eagle to take Eden?
Yes, absolutely. He'd struck that deal, and the only way that he was going to save his skin was to trick Eden to come down into the forest and be taken away, because Thiazi wanted the golden apples for himself. He wanted to eat them.
Oh, brilliant. And one more, and then we'll hand over to Kafbad. What made big question here. What made Loki turn bad in the first place?
Well, that's the thing. Is Loki bad? Loki, I think Loki's just a bit naughty and a bit selfish. And he's looking out for number one, really. I tend to think that he's more mischievous and misunderstood until the later stories when he does things that are a bit naughtier. There is I've just seen a really, really interesting one about the giants were seen as equals to the gods in many ways, and that's actually very true. We're not even really sure if they were giants. They might have just been a different group of people, because did you know that some of the gods married the giants?
Oh.
And you might hear more about that later.
Ooh, exciting. Well, I think we'll hand over now to Cathbad, who has different sorts of tales of life a bit more locally to the Galloway Glens area. So over to you, Cathbad.
Hello. Yes. Hi. Thank you, Olaf. That was an awesome story. Life is complicated. You were thinking about Loki there, and is Loki evil? Is Loki just mischievous? Well, one of the ways you can find out about things is to listen to stories. And if you look at the landscape as well, you can see that language is layered over landscape. And if you learn to read the names of places, then you can learn about the places. In Galloway, there's a place called Dalry, which is the place of the king. And it's a beautiful place. And if you took your cattle anywhere, you'd want to take your cattle down there to graze. Just watch out for the eagles in the trees and wandering Aesir wanting to steal them. But recognizing a place is one thing. Recognizing character is another. And this is a story of a king called Olaf. But although he was maybe born a king, his life was not straightforward. His life involved him being a slave. It involved him fighting for his freedom, becoming a warrior, becoming a Viking, a law unto himself, and becoming a king, and then even a saint. So I'm going to tell you a little bit from it. And it starts when he was visiting a land we call Denmark. And there was a queen there, the queen called Gira. Now, this queen had been told that there was a brave man, a strong man, and lots of ships in a harbour nearby. So that could be a little bit threatening. She had a good solution. She invited them all for a feast. Now, this wasn't just a party that lasts one day. This was a party that lasted all winter. So rather than braving the stormy seas and freezing their beards, Olaf and his men could feast with Gira. And while they were feasting, they were talking. And while they were talking, Olaf kind of took a liking to Gira. So he asked her if there was anything he could do for her. Well, she mentioned that there were a few towns in Vendland that weren't paying taxes. They were rebelling against her. So this sounded like a job which Olaf and his men could take care of. And take care of it they did. For 3 years, they travelled around Vendland, fighting, taking things under control and collecting taxes for Gira. And Olaf and Gira grew so close to each other they got married. Maybe you could say it was Olaf's dream come true. He was a king with a queen and a band of men who could travel around and wage war. Then tragedy struck. Gira died. That's a hard thing when someone dies. And Olaf, well, he responded in the way that characterized his character at the time. When he'd seen the person who owned him as a slave in the marketplace one day, he grabbed an axe, ran across the marketplace, and even though he was only a small child, he buried the axe in his former master's head. Not a very calm and placid man was Olaf. So when Gira died, he went raiding. And he raided to Friesland, down to what we now call Holland. He raided up to the Orkneys in the north. He raided the Hebrides, the islands of Bride. He sailed further south. He raided the Scots in Dalrieta. He raided the Isle of Man. He raided Ireland. And maybe he drew his longship up on the shores of Galloway and raided there too. Who knows? Then he went south. That's known. He went south and he raided the lands of Mercia and the Angles and the Saxons, because they were filthy rich and lazy, so he could steal from them all he wanted. But to settle for the winter, he settled in a group of islands called the Scilly Isles. And while he was in the Scilly Isles, he heard about a seer. Now that's an odd word. We don't use it much anymore. But a seer was somebody who could see the future, who could tell you the meaning of things. And this sounded really useful to someone like Olaf, who had been a slave and a king and was now, well, a brigand. So what he did was he decided he would test the seer. And he got one of his men, the biggest, strongest man in the ship, and put all the fine clothes on him, and all the silver and the jewels, and gave him a good sword, and told him to go up and pretend to be Olaf to the seer. Dum, dum, dum. This big guy walked up from the beach, shining like the sun, with a sword like silver and a face like thunder, maybe. Before he even reached the house of the seer was sitting there going, "Aye, yeah, you look great. A mighty peacock strutting his stuff. But if Olaf wants to talk to me, Olaf needs to come and talk to me himself. No dressing up in fancy clothes. I can see things." At which Olaf's man went back and reported to Olaf, and Olaf was interested. So Olaf went and started to talk to the seer and discussed quite a lot of things. Now, imagine you were the seer. You can see the future. But a king, and a king with a violent temper, comes up to you and asks to tell their future. What do? Do you tell them all the things that they want to hear? Well, if you do that and you just tell them sweet things, then maybe they'll come back and blame you when things go wrong. Or do you tell them fire and brimstone and all the bad things that are going to happen to them? Well, you might scare them. And then when people are scared, they react violently. So they might kill you on the spot. So the seer had a good solution. He told them a little bit of good stuff and a little bit of bad stuff and started chatting. And told him that he would become a mighty king. Olaf would be known the world over as a mighty king, and more than that, a saint. But while he was here, there was mutiny plotting in his camp. When Olaf would return to his ships, he would find that half of his men had decided that they didn't want Olaf to be in charge anymore, and they were going to draw swords and attack him, and there'd be a battle. And the sign that Olaf would know that the seer was telling the truth is, although he would win the battle, he would be injured so badly that he would be carried off the battlefield on his shield. So maybe Olaf had a lot to think about when Olaf went back to his ships. But before he could think too much, half his men mutinied. Maybe they were worried about what he'd been talking about with the seer. Maybe he'd been worried that Olaf was going to leave all of the ancestral gods behind and become a Christian, and it just wouldn't work out. And there was a big battle, there was a big fight, and there was much bloodshed, and well, Olaf won, but he was carried off the battle on his shield, back to the ship. And it took 7 days for him to recover. While he was there recovering, well, maybe he thought things over. Maybe this was his closest experience with death so far. Who knows? But what is known is that he went back up and talked to the seer and found out the seer was a prophet, a monk, one of the church in the islands. They did crazy things like jump into boats with no mast and no oars and see where God would take them. But anyway, this monk told Olaf more about his future and gave him some men to help him in spreading the gospel throughout the known world. And Olaf set sail again. Maybe he was a changed man. Who knows? There was a thing called. Now, you might not know what a thing is, but a thing is when someone has a thing and they call everyone round to discuss it, to talk about how it's going to happen. And you have it in a place, a wold. So you get places called thing-wold, like Tynald on the Isle of Man, or Tynald just north of Dumfries, or the Storting, where it's the big thing where everyone gets everything sorted. This thing was called by a lady called Gaida. Now, Gaida was the sister of the King of all Ireland, or at least he called himself that. Another Olaf, Olaf Cuaran. And Gaida had been married to a Mercian in the north of England, and he was a very wealthy man. But, well, he died. Death was quite common back then. And she wanted a new husband. So she called a thing to get all of the eligible men in the country round so she could pick which one she would choose. Being a woman at that time isn't just about washing dishes. It's also about managing estates and making canny decisions. So she had a look around the crowd that gathered, and Olaf had heard about it. But this time, Olaf, when he arrived, didn't wear all of his fine clothes. He wore his seagoing gear, still had salt in his beard, probably blisters on his hands, and I doubt he had a fishing net kind of in his hand too, but he certainly stood out from the crowd. And Gaida saw him, and, well, they started chatting, and she asked him if she were to say, "Would you like to become my husband?" How would he respond? And he mentioned that, you know, if she were to ask, he would be quite interested. So they got engaged, and it was all going to be really happy, except there was a man called Alfheim. Alfheim made his fortune through fighting. He was a duelist. He would challenge rich people to a fight by insulting them or things like that. And then the way at the time to sort it out would be for the two people to go to an island and have a fight, and one of them would come back. And, well, nothing would be discussed, but only one would remain, so the issue would be solved. Alfheim wanted to marry Gaida. So when Olaf was picked, he started a fight. Proper ritual combat, you know, proper sacred stuff, none of this brawling or pub fighting. Him and his 12 men versus Olaf and Olaf's 12 men. Olaf looked, weighed up the situation, and said to his men, "Okay, copy my lead, I'll have this sorted, but you must copy everything I do." Him and Alfheim squared off against each other. Alfine with his fine, shining sword, probably with gold and silver inlay on its hilt. Finely balanced, precious, Olaf stood there with his axe. They faced each other down. Alfine drew his sword, and Olaf just gave 2 swings of his axe. The first, he disarmed Alfine, knocking the sword clear out of his hand. The second, he hit Alfine on the head with his axe, just like he'd killed the slave master way back in his youth. Except not quite. Olaf had changed. This time he hit with the back of the axe, and Alfine fell to the floor as if dead, but not dead. And then Olaf tied him up, and all of his men did the same to all of Olaf's men, all of Alfine's men, and Alfine was arrested. Well, they didn't quite work arrest that same way. He was banished. Question is, where do you recognize kingship? Is it in being able to bury an axe in someone's head, or to be able to restrain your axe so you don't kill him? And then he was exiled. Alfine exiled to the wide world. Now, is that a mercy? Alfine still had his life, but he didn't have any reputation. He didn't have any fame. So maybe it was an opportunity for Alfine to change his ways and find a new way of living that didn't involve killing farmers for their goods. Who knows? That's Alfine's story. Olaf's story continued with being married to Gyda and spending half his time in Ireland and half his time in England. And then, well, things got better. There was an opportunity in Norway that came up. So he took advantage of that and he became king. That's a long story. But this part is coming to an end. And hopefully at the end of it, you'll be able to recognize some place names in Galloway and recognize kingship in somebody when you see them, whether they're a human or whether they're one of the Aesir. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Kafbad. Thank you so much. That's really interesting tales. There's been some discussion on the chat. It sounds like Alfine's just a professional troublemaker, but then somebody else suggested that he's been outlawed and therefore is got nothing to lose.
Yeah, professional troublemaker, outlaw, probably very much like Olaf was after the death of his first wife. You make a law for yourself, live by your sword, die by your sword, and drink lots in between.
So how many people here, I want to know where Dalry is in the Galloway Glens? That's up, just up obviously in the Glen Kens, just up north of Loch Ken. Somebody else has said, are there any other place name meanings? We talked about Tinvald and Storting.
Well, I've heard of Criffel, Crawfjell, the crow fell, the steep hill. Fell is a word that the Scots use. It's also a word that the Norwegians use. If you look around the coast, you find a lot of Norwegian names that have stuck. If you look further inland, you get Gaelic names. And the Norwegians themselves, the Vikings, learned to speak Gaelic. So maybe some of the Gaelic names are actually there because of Norwegians who became Scots. Everything blurs and blends. But there are experts you can ask and look up place names in the Galloway Glens in particular.
Yeah, no, and we're a place of trade and a place of market and a place of layered languages because of it, aren't we? Yes, that's what we hear a lot when historical people's wives die. They get angry. Yes, I think for most of civilization, that's how it's gone. Hopefully, slightly better now. Any other questions for Kafbad about the exciting life that he had? I have a question. Is that picture behind you Christian?
This one here?
Yes.
Yes.
Ah.
There's a tale told that when Augustine first arrived in the south of England, he carried painted boards with him. And that was well before the Vikings, but it's still the story that comes down. Or if you want a Scottish thing, then a book possibly made by Columba and Iona. It's a sacred treasure, and it has paintings like this in it too. There's all sorts of symbols in there.
Yeah.
Like another 10 stories to tell.
Yeah, and again, it's the mixing of the cultures, isn't it? We've got a question here. How many swords have you got, Kafbad?
This sword here is a beautiful sword. If I were to die and be buried in Ardnamurchan, I would quite like to be buried with a sword like this. I have my grandfather's sword as well. This is a knife, really, one edge. It's called a long knife, a lang sax, but a sword too. It's more useful for hacking and smiting. But if you're fortunate enough, blessed to have a whale wash up on your shore, it's great for chopping up the whale so your whole village can feed.
That's the tool for the job. Well, that's fabulous. I'm just conscious of the time, so we have got some more questions coming in, really interesting questions, but I think maybe we'll swap back over to Olaf just now and hear the second part of her tales of mystery and
mischief. I'd love to hear another Olaf story.
Yeah, there's Olaf, as if by magic. Over to you.
Hello, welcome back. Thank you, Kafbad. I always enjoy Kafbad stories. Sometimes Kafbad and I end up round the same fires, telling tales until the wee small hours of the morning. It's a great way to spend your time because, especially right now, there's nothing else to do at night except sit around. It's dark and it's cold and it's rainy, so tell each other stories. It's a great way to spend an evening. So, this next story is kind of like a part 2 to the story you just heard from me. We all know what happened. This nasty Thiazi tried to steal Eden, and he ended up squished and on fire in Asgard and dead. But this story, this begins back in the land of the giants in Jotunheim, back at Thiazi's castle. In fact, in the hall of his castle. But Thiazi wasn't there, was he? No. He had been killed by the gods in Asgard because he had tried to kidnap Eden, the goddess with the beautiful golden apples. But what you didn't know is Thiazi had a daughter. And she was tall, and she was strong, and she was beautiful. And she sat in the hall waiting for her father to return. She knew where he had gone, and she waited patiently. And the hours went by, and she realised slowly deep in her heart that her father wasn't returning. She knew that her father was dead, and she began to fill with anger and rage. And she knew the gods were responsible. She knew Odin and Loki and Thor, all of them were responsible, and she wanted revenge. So she did what any angry woman would do, and she went to the weapons room, and she began to dress for battle. So the first thing she did was she selected a helmet, strong, could withstand any weapon, and she put this on her head. Then, to protect her body, she gathered the finest chainmail that she could find, and she put this on her body to protect herself. Then she began to gather her weapons. She chose her favourite axe, strong and sharp. Then her favourite sword, and this she would use to cut down the gods that had killed her father. And lastly, her favourite weapon of all, and mine too, the spear. She made sure it was sharp. This is the one that she would use on Odin. When she was ready, she nurtured that anger, became furious and strong, and she began to march towards Asgard. With every step she took, her anger grew and grew. And she arrived at Asgard, and she stood there, her weaponry and chainmail shining in the sun, and she demanded to see the gods. She shouted so loudly it was like thunder in the sky. And the gods were inside going, uh-oh, I think we're in trouble. The gods knew who she was, and they came out slowly and gathered on the walls of Asgard and looked down towards her. She stood there, looking ferocious, and she cried at the top of her voice, My name is Skadi, daughter of Thiazi. You killed my father. Prepare to die. Now, the gods were tired. They were sick of war. It wasn't that long since they had to repair the walls of Asgard after the last battle. So they pleaded with Skadi to see if there was some other way that they could resolve this. She stood there and she thought for a moment. She looked down and she looked up with sadness in her eyes and said, I am alone now. My heart is sad. And if you can change that, then I may forgive you. What I want is a husband, to be chosen from one of you, and for you to make me laugh. It's been such a long, long time since I laughed. Now, the gods weren't too happy about this. They really didn't want a giant to marry one of them. The giants were their enemies, and they wanted, to keep it that way. But they also wanted to avoid another war, so reluctantly they agreed. Skadi looked up at the gods, lined up along the wall. She looked back and forth, scanning them until her eyes settled upon one. She pointed and said, I want that one. She had chosen Balder, the brightest and most handsome of all the gods, and some say the bravest, but don't tell Thor. Odin wasn't happy about this at all. He said, oh, wait a minute, we agreed that you could marry one of us, but there's one condition. Skadi rolled her eyes and said, what is it? Odin said, well, you must choose your husband only by his feet. It's a bit odd, but she agreed. Surely if Balder was the most handsome of them all, then he would have the nicest feet, so this would be easy. The gods invited Skadi into their great hall and prepared for her to choose her husband. They brought in a huge wooden screen with holes cut out at the bottom for the feet to poke through. And once the gods shuffled behind and popped their feet through, Skadi was invited to make her choice. She walked up slowly, taking time to inspect each set of feet carefully. She walked up to the first set of toes. Oh no, hairy toes, no thank you, not that one. She moved on to the next one. Ah, yuck, those toes are so long they look like fingers. Ugh, no thank you. And the next set of feet, she looked and said, oh, there's so much dirt on them, there's practically grass growing out of them. She moved on, the next set of feet. Before she could get close to them, she immediately said, oh, those ones definitely haven't been washed in a while. And she moved on again. Finally, she found a pair of feet that were clean, normal sized, not smelly, and absolutely not hairy. These must be Balder's feet. No other god could possibly have feet as lovely as these. I choose him, what perfect feet. That is my husband. And she stood back waiting for him to walk round the screen. But who stepped out from behind the screen was not Balder. It was Njord, god who spent many, many hours at the sea, and the salt water and coarse sand were the reason that he had such lovely, smooth feet. Skadi couldn't argue, she couldn't disagree. This is what she had agreed to, and the pair had to become married. And they became husband and wife. Now, the next part of this deal was the gods were to make Skadi laugh. And this job was given to Loki, of course. Now, they gathered in the great hall for the feast, the wedding feast. The gods were having a great time. They were drinking, they were singing, they were falling over drunk and breaking things, as you do at weddings. But Loki was preparing to make Skadi laugh, and when he walked into the hall, it all went silent, because he'd walked into the hall with a goat. My lady Skadi, he cried, I am here to make you laugh. Skadi, sitting, with a face like stone, and Loki knew this would be a lot of hard work. From his pocket, however, he took out a piece of string. He tied one side to the goat's beard. He took the other side and he tied it somewhere really sensitive and delicate, and somewhere you definitely should never tie string round them. His ears. And a tug of war began. At one side, the goat with the string tied round his beard. At the other side, Loki with the string tied round his ears. It went backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and neither side would give in. But with one final tug, Loki fell forwards and landed in Skadi's lap. And then something strange happened. Skadi laughed. She laughed long and hard, like she hadn't laughed this way in years. And for the first time, she wasn't sad. The gods had held up their part of the bargain, but as one final gift to her, Odin had taken her father's eyes and thrown them into the sky so they could be stars looking down on her forever. Now, the marriage didn't go quite so well. Skadi and Njord argued a lot, but they mainly argued about where to live. Skadi hated living by the seaside. The sound of the waves and the boats and the seagulls drove her mad. But Njord, he hated living in the mountains. The wind and the howling of the wolves kept him awake. So they agreed to be married, but they would live apart. Sounds like a good idea to me. And Skadi spent the rest of her time hiking and skiing through the snowy mountains. And some say now, if you're ever out in the mountains in the winter when it's snowy, you might just catch sight of her. And that is the story of the marriage of Njord and Skadi.
Fabulous. Thank you, Olaf. Yes, you're right, Moman. Don't choose your husband by their feet, or I would say by their face. Get to know them.
Yes.
Right, anyway, enough of the life lessons. What is with the arrows in the background? Ingeborg would like to know. Are they part of your weapon room?
Yes, these are part of my weapon room. So these are my arrows. And as you can see, they are very sharp. So yes, I use these sometimes when you're traveling. You have to look after yourself. So I carry my weapons with me for protection.
Do you feel like you need to be more protected because you're a woman?
No, I think that when they see you carrying weapons, they can't see if you're a boy or a girl at first. They see the weapons and they go, oh, as you were.
Very good. And another question from Moman. Are those Viking letters behind you?
Yes, they are. This is my name. And then I have secret magical incantations round the side to spellbind you and make you love my stories.
Fabulous. Yes, runes. Would we call them runes, or is it the Norse alphabet? Or is that the same thing?
Runes, these are runes, and they were basically so you could carve them onto things. They weren't nice and rounded like this weird language that you lot use. You would carve them with something sharp onto a stick or a stone.
Very good.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Ah.
Do I think the story's true? I think all the stories are true, of course. The gods. And are Viking Tales gory? Well, the ones I've told you today were quite nice. But I do tell some of the stories that are not so nice. Some of them can be rather gory. Some quite nasty things happen in some of the stories.
Which feet were Thor's? Which do you think was he the dirty one?
Oh, a couple of good questions. Thor didn't take part in this game because he's already married, and he's married to Sif. And Sif is the one with the beautiful long golden hair, and she would not have tolerated that. Viking women were quite scary. She would have said, absolutely not. Get your feet back here. Absolutely. And who's my favourite god? I have to say Thor. I know everybody loves Thor, but I love Thor because he's the protector of man, and he's always going out and having adventures, and he always ends up in Jotunheim. Always getting up to mischief.
Who's your least favourite god?
Oh, I don't have a least favourite. I think they're all amazing. I really do. Probably Loki. Loki annoys me because he's always up to no good. But because he's up to no good, that means we get such amazing stories.
Yes. Well, and there's a good question from Chris. Why do they keep trusting him?
I think, well, imagine you have a naughty brother or sister and they're always getting up to naughty things. You still love them, don't you? You still love them and you probably forgive them and give them a chance over and over again.
Yeah.
I think that's why.
Fabulous. And then I think we'll just do one more here. What was Jotunheim like?
Oh, not it was full of giants for a start. And everything was much bigger there. But yeah, so when the world was created, this is another story that I do, but I won't do it today because it's very long. When the world was created, they created Jotunheim to keep the giants in. So there's supposed to be a big kind of fence keeping them in, because the giants were a bit naughty, as you'll see in lots of the stories. So not a nice place to be, I would imagine. I've never been, have you?
Oh, very good. Right, well, in that case, I think we'll just hand over to Kafbad now for some more tales of daring do.
Daring and adventure in this tale. Olaf tells stories of the Aesir, the Norse gods, and I'm telling the stories of the people who are my ancestors. But, well, if you want to find out about the gods, then it's the relationship of gods and humans that is really interesting. And this is a story of one of the ancestors who was known as a Volsung. But remember I said that language is layered over landscape, and if you learn the words, you can read who's been there. Well, it's not just over the top of the landscape that you can find out things. You can find out the top, like Olaf's runes. If you look in Rothwell, you can find the runes that carve stories. If you go to the far west, to Stranraer, you can find a story carved on a stone, or bits of a story, and they're bits from the story I'm going to tell. If you dig a little bit deeper, then maybe you'll find some treasure. Nicely bagged up, this treasure. And maybe, if I want to keep it safe, I could bury it in the ground so that nobody would find my shining silver. Didn't see it's trapped already. But loads of people love treasure, and I will do great things to get a hold of shining silver, or even greater things to get at gold. But then, this is a small glass bead, and it's one of a pair. The other one is buried with one of my relatives in a town called Kirkcudbright. And maybe in 1,000 years, people will dig it up, and maybe they'll find the brooch that I put in there as well, a nice ring pin. Or, if they're really lucky, as a way of showing how great a warrior my relative was, we buried a sword with him too, a mark of his status. This story has treasure, it has a sword, and it has a man in it. But all men come from somewhere, and this one arrived in the story as a refugee, not even born yet. His mother fled fear and fled a battle where her husband had died. Fled with some treasure, some wealth, and a broken sword. The sword broke in the battle, and the sword breaking broke the man as well. Some say maybe Odin broke the sword in the middle of the battle, which would be harsh because it was Odin who'd given the sword to the family in the first place. But yeah, she had to flee. She was picked up by some Vikings, and one Viking in particular called King Alf. King Alf was a good man, a generous man, a good giver of gifts, but a giver of gifts made much more wealthy for having rescued Sigurd's mother. Hjordis, she was called. So Sigurd, when he was born, grew up in the house with another man acting like a father to him. And it was the tradition at the time to foster people to other rich, skillful men so that they could learn skills. And it was a way of cementing alliances so that you didn't get so many battles. So Sigurd had Alf as his household father and had a smith, a hammerer of metal, called Regin, as his foster father. And he learned lots of things from Regin. Regin was skillful at shaping steel and silver. He was cunning in his mind, and he thought a lot. And he taught Sigurd many things. But one day, when Sigurd turned up at his forge, Regin started asking pointed questions. So, Sigurd, your father, how wealthy was he? Where is that wealth? Who's looking after that wealth? And Sigurd thought about this a bit, because while he lacked for nothing and anything he needed he could get, he actually had nothing that he could claim was his own. Could be a good way to run a society. But, well, Regin kept asking these questions and encouraging Sigurd to decide that he should own things himself. Maybe in the same way as Odin is said to inspire people to great deeds, although these great deeds might come at a price. Anyhow, this is Sigurd, and he was still young, and the first thing he wanted was a horse. So he went to his father, King Alf, and said, well, can I have a horse? You know, testing to see whether the common property could become his or not. And Alf, being a generous king, said, yes, go to my stables, choose whichever horse you want. Great. So Sigurd went down to the stables and started looking at the horses, checking the hooves, checking if they were too worn, checking the teeth, that was a bit bitey, and finding out which horse would be the best horse for him. And while he was doing that, he had his eyes set on a particular horse. This old geezer came along with a hat pulled down low over one eye. And he sort of looked at Sigurd and said, choosing a horse, are you? Yeah, you could do it this way, or I've got a better way to choose a horse. All you need to do is lift off the stable bars off the door, open the doors, and drive all the horses into the river. It'll cause havoc, but you'll see which one's the best. And Sigurd thought for a while, actually probably didn't think that much at all. He's a Viking. He kicked all the horses out into the river, and they all ran into the river, but most of them stopped and shied on the bank. And one horse, only one horse, went straight into the river and started to swim across and upstream. Sigurd knew that was the horse for him. And as he was on his way back, the old guy with the hat over one ear said, hey, look after that horse. It's descended from Sleipnir himself. And then he disappeared. Strange. Ideas are like that, aren't they? Then he asked somebody, why did you do that? So Sigurd was riding around on his horse thinking, yay, I'm the man. And he went back to Regin and said, hey, do you like my beautiful horse? It's only got 4 legs, but it's descended from one that had 8. They moved so fast. And Regin went, you've got a horse, but do me a favor and I'll get you a sword. A sword? That's a good plan. So Regin told him that up in the hills there was this dragon, a dragon that sat on a pile of gold in a cave. And the dragon breathed poison out across the landscape and scorched it, and then no living thing could grow there. And so obviously the dragon needed to be killed. Well, Regin said, I'll make you the best sword that's ever been made if you take it and you kill that dragon for you. Well, fair enough. Sigurd offered to kill the dragon for Regin in return for the sword. And Regin started hammering the sword. Ching, 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 ching. Sigurd rode away a bit, did some things, came back. Sword was ready. Sigurd picked it up, weighed it in his hand, felt the balance, and then lifted it up high above his head and slammed it down on the anvil. What do you think happened? The sword shattered. Many pieces. It's an anvil. It's used to make swords. It can also break them. Sigurd wasn't happy. He'd heard about this dragon. This was a mighty dragon. It was so big, it was like 30 fathoms in length on its neck. It could stop at the top of a cliff and still drink from down the bottom of the cliff. So he said, Regin, this just won't do. Make me a better sword. And Regan took all the bits of metal and all the weight of his mind and brought the bones of the earth and mixed it with coal from the forests and blew air in and made the fire burn hot and drew out from it another sword. Sigurd picked it up and it was especially nice, better balanced. He raised it up higher and slammed it down on the anvil. What do you think happened this time? The sword broke again, but not before it had cut a notch out of the anvil. It was a good sword. It was an excellent sword, but to kill an unearthly dragon, Sigurd needed an unearthly sword. So he went and did what you should always do if you're facing a problem. He asked his mum. And his mum went to her treasure chest and pulled out the broken shards of his father's sword. And Sigurd took those broken bits of blade to Regan. And Regan took the broken bits and took some more metal. And maybe he took the noise of a cat walking. Maybe he took the beards of women. Maybe he took the roots of mountains and the breath of fish and put them into the blade as well. Or maybe all of those had been used up by some other dwarven smiths in another story. Doesn't matter. What matters is that this sword, when it was drawn out of the fire, it was as if flames were running along the blade. It was as if the whole blade was on fire. And you can sometimes see the fire in a blade that shows that it's been well made, and it'll win you fame. Sigurd took it and tested it in the water. He held it in the river and the fleece floated down, a bit of woolen fleece floated down just with the force of the current, touched the edge of the blade and split in two. That sword was sharp, it was strong, and Sigurd's arm was mighty. So he got on his horse, called Cluaran, and started riding, with Regan there to keep him company and to advise him. Because facing a dragon is no small feat. If you stand in front of it, it'll breathe fire and poison at you, and you die that way. If you sneak up behind it trying to get advantage, it's got a tail. It'll bat you into the middle of the next story. So Regan advised digging a hole and lying in the hole until the dragon came down to eat. And then, when the dragon was over the top, Sigurd would be able to stab up and kill the dragon. Great idea. So Sigurd's digging. When a guy, like an old guy with a battered hat pulled down over one eye, came up and said, "Oh, what are you doing?" Sigurd went, "I'm digging a hole." "Nah, don't want to dig a hole there. Dig it over here. You're digging it round. That's wrong." Sigurd went, "What? You're telling me about digging holes?" And then the man with the battered hat got really to the point. "Okay, you're going to stab a dragon. It's going to bleed. If it bleeds and you're in a hole underneath, the hole is going to fill up with blood. Can you breathe underwater?" At which Sigurd thought, "Oh yeah, this thinking thing is a good idea." And he dug more holes and he linked them together this time. And maybe he started to suspect Regan a little at this point in time too. His advice wasn't always the best. It was a tiring night. Sigurd lay in the hole when a scraping and a clawing and a shuffling of doom sluck its way towards the river. And the poison spread across the air. But Sigurd was safe underneath. And when the dragon was right overhead, Sigurd thrust up, stabbing with his sharp sword up to his armpit in dragon. It was a big dragon. And the blood poured out and filled the hole and went over the hole and filled the other hole and bled away all down towards the river. Sigurd kept his head above blood and was okay and was safe and crawled out. And while he was there, the story in its long version describes the conversation he had with the dragon. But all you need to know is that the dragon warned him about the treasure and warned him that the man who he had sent him to kill him, Regan, was actually the dragon's brother. The dragon was called Fafnir. Regan and Fafnir brothers. This was all about a dispute over gold and who owned it. So maybe Sigurd started thinking again. And he had plenty of time to think because, well, on Regan's instructions, he cut out the heart of the dragon and he put it on a spit, like a spear over a fire to cook. And as the flames warmed the heart, it started to cook, and the skin started to sort of char a little. And well, Sigurd took his thumb and sort of prodded it to see if it was ready yet. Ow! It hurt! It was hot. He stuck it in his mouth. When he stuck his thumb in his mouth, he started to hear the birds tweeting in the trees behind him. And birds twitter a lot, and they say many things. And not all of them are nice, but they love a good gossip. So these birds were gossiping about Regin. And they said, oh, look at that Sigurd there, cooking somebody else's meal. That's Regin. That's Regin who's ordered Fafnir killed. Do you know that they both killed their father over a treasure hoard and over a ring? Oh, look. Now there's Regin, tweet, 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 creeping up behind Sigurd, tweet, 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 ready to stab him in the back so he can get all the treasure to himself, tweet, tweet, tweet. At which Sigurd, being a warrior, immediately jumped up and instinctively turned round and slashed and cut Regin's head off. So, landed plop and started rolling down the hill. Well, that was that done. And that was the end of part of a larger story. Sigurd, however, had plenty to go for his and rode off to the cave where the treasure was. And he took all the treasure out and he piled it on the back of Granny, his horse. And then he tried to get the horse to walk, and the horse wasn't budging. Then Sigurd realised what the problem was. The horse was embarrassed. Sigurd was not on his back too. This was such a great horse that he expected not only to be able to carry the treasure, but also to be able to carry Sigurd as well, so that they could ride back into town looking like the best kings that they were going to be. Well, that is where Sigurd rides off into the rest of his story. And just as he was going in the cave, he saw a little glint of gold. And looking more closely, he saw a ring. And the ring looked precious to him. So he got off his horse, he went back to it, and he picked it up. And, well, he could have left it there, like you leave things at the edge of your field for people who are poor and need something. But no, he wanted all the treasure. And even though he'd been warned by the dragon that the treasure would be the death of him, he had the thought, some people, everyone's going to die. Some people are afraid of dying. I'm not going to be one of them. I'm going to live, and I'm not going to let my fear rule me. He put the ring on, and, well, you can tell, or you can hear that story told later somewhere else. And just now, if you want to find swords, go looking at Kukubri. If you want to find the story, go to Kirkham and to the Kilmorey stone, and you'll see carved on there, possibly by a king called Sigurd, elements from this story, and on the other side, a cross. Thank you very much for listening.
Fabulous. Thank you, Kafbad. And we'll get all the links from that Kafbad's mentioned, and we'll post them on our Galloway Glens and Can You Dig It social media so that we can get those out to you. We've got loads of other links as well for further reading. But are there any questions for Kafbad just now? I know we had a question earlier on about it was another place name, wasn't it? Was it Valney or Walney? On the I'm just going back. Yes, Walney.
I think you would have to ask someone who's more learned in place names than me.
Yeah.
I speak Norsk, Festamai for the Gaelic speakers from the Isle of Man. I don't know all the words and all the names.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, have your travels taken you through Borg? Do you know anything about the place name of Borg? There's a big place name theme here. At the end of this, the Galloway Glens has a project called Place Names of the Galloway Glens. So if you go onto the Galloway Glens website, www.gallowayglens.org, and look through projects, one of our whole projects is called Place Names of the Galloway Glens. And then there's a whole new database that's been created. I think it's got 2,500 place names in the Galloway Glens area. So maybe instead of putting Kafbad on the spot, that would be a good resource to go and look at.
I saw a question, did Regin and his brother quarrel when they were kids? I think so. There were three brothers, Regin, Fafnir and Otter. And they were all great brothers, but they would have quarreled. Fafnir was the biggest one, the strongest one, which is probably why he became a dragon. Regin was the cunning one and the smith. And Otter, well, Otter's life in the stories is very short. He could turn into an otter and catch fish, but he was caught by Loki. And well, that was the start of the treasure and the ring and many more stories. So you can look for them and maybe you'll find someone to tell them.
Awesome. That sounds really good. But Mo, I think I saw you on the video there with potentially with your brother. Is it? You don't need to carry it through to adulthood, to the death. Barnaby Fry is asking, how do I become a Viking? I think we've got something on that at the end. You were born to it, Kafbad, weren't you? But I think we've got something on it at the end.
You go to the sea in ships. Find yourself. Oh yeah. If you want to become a Viking, find yourself someone you trust. Get fostered out to them, and then they can teach you how to live as a Viking. And more importantly, how to live without dying as a Viking.
Crucially. Lucy, what is your favourite sword there? There's one you said you wanted to be buried with, didn't you?
This one here. Yeah, definitely.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's it's got it's been smithed with a hollow up the blade here, so it's lighter. So it's long and it's light and it's strong as well, and tough.
Fabulous. Lewis is asking, what happened to all the dragons?
What happened to all the dragons?
Where do we think they went?
Some of them got trapped into stones by Olaf so that people would listen to our stories. Or maybe when you listen to stories, things aren't quite as they seem. Maybe instead of asking questions like, where is Asgard, where are the dragons? If you look into your mind, then you can think how the dragons and places like Asgard can be found in your head or in stories, and they tell you more about you than you could find from a map, which is more riddles, and that's what you get when you ask questions about myths.
But I think you're right, Moman. A human can become anything, good or bad. And no, a person's form doesn't match their personality. You can't get to know someone from the outside. You've got to get to know them on the inside. Right. Apart from maybe in a myth.
Well, it's a question, and we create the society we want to live in. For Vikings, like when Olaf is traveling, Olaf carries weapons. So people see from a distance someone to be reckoned with. And that works at one level. But if you feed Olaf and give Olaf food, then Olaf will tell you stories and you'll find another level of person. And if you are very good friends with somebody, then you find the really deep things that make them tick over a long period of time.
Thank you so much to Olaf and Cathbad. I think just to hear a little bit about your life and your myths and your stories is absolutely fabulous. Olaf and Cathbad were brought to us by the Cluaran Historical Interpretation Project, and we've got a little bit more information about that at the end as well. Thanks as well to Claire and the team at Rathmel Archaeology, behind the scenes support there. Rathmel Archaeology is delivering Can You Dig It for the Galloway Glens. I do need to say a thank you to the National Lottery, Heritage Fund and Historic Environment Scotland. They fund Can You Dig It, and that allows us to put on this event and all our events for free to the volunteers. That's very much appreciated. If you'd like to hear more stories, you can slightly amazingly find both Olaf and Cathbad on Facebook. So I'll put the links for them up at the end if you'd like some more tales and stories. Can You Dig It and Galloway Glens have both got quite a strong social media. So if you've enjoyed this and you don't already, then follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Galloway Glens, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or search for Can You Dig It, or it's at GGLP Archaeology. I'll put the link up at the end. Both of them are just a steady stream of just lovely heritage-related goodness. So fill your boots. Give us a follow if you want to stay up to date. So I do hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you so much for coming. We had a great turnout. And I hope maybe that we'll see you at some more Galloway Glens events another time.